They were called failures, embarrassments, career-ending disasters. So how did these same films become untouchable classics? In the 1970s, studios buried them. Critics dismissed them. Audiences ignored them. But something didn't add up, because years later, these bombs came back, stronger, louder, and impossible to ignore. What really went wrong the first time? And which of these films should never have failed at all? Because one of them almost destroyed Hollywood itself. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975. It didn't just fail, it collapsed quietly. When it first hit theaters, audiences didn't know what they were watching. A musical? A horror parody? Something else entirely? The tone was chaotic, the performances exaggerated, and the marketing completely misunderstood it. When studios expected a quick return, instead they got confusion and empty seats. But then something strange happened. Midnight screenings began. Small at first, then louder, then ritualistic. Audiences didn't just watch it, they participated. Costumes, callbacks, entire theaters transformed into live performances. What Hollywood saw as a box office disaster became something far more powerful, a cultural movement. And that's what makes its failure so fascinating. It wasn't rejected because it was bad. It was rejected because it arrived too early, too strange, too different for its time. Decades later, it's no longer a film. It's an experience, a phenomenon that refuses to die. And the same studios that once buried it? They now celebrate it as one of the most successful cult revivals in film history. It didn't just survive failure. It rewrote what success could even look like. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. Today, it feels untouchable. But when it was released, it barely made a dent. The tone confused audiences. It wasn't the bright, safe children's story people expected. It was darker, stranger, almost unsettling at times. And that discomfort cost it. Families stayed away. Critics didn't fully embrace it. The box office numbers reflected that hesitation. But time has a way of revealing what first impressions miss, because beneath the candy-colored surface was something far more complex, a story about greed, morality, and consequence. As the years passed, television reruns introduced it to a new generation, and this time, it connected, deeply. The eerie tone that once pushed audiences away became its defining strength. Or the performance at its center? Iconic, unpredictable, impossible to replicate. Suddenly, what once felt off now felt genius. The film didn't change. The audience did. And that shift transformed it from a quiet failure into one of the most beloved fantasy films ever made. A reminder that sometimes, magic isn't immediate. Sometimes it takes time to be understood. Sorcerer, 1977. It had everything. A visionary director, a massive budget, a premise built on pure tension. And yet, it never stood a chance, because it was released at the worst possible moment. Just weeks after a little film changed everything. Star Wars. Audiences didn't want bleak, slow-burning dread. They wanted escape, adventure, spectacle. And Sorcerer offered none of that. It was intense, relentless, unforgiving. Or a story about men transporting explosive cargo through impossible terrain, where every second felt like it could be their last. But instead of drawing crowds, it was overshadowed, ignored, almost erased. For years, it carried the label of failure, until people went back. And when they did, they saw something different. Not a misfire, but a masterpiece of tension. The filmmaking was precise, the atmosphere suffocating, the danger real. It didn't fail because it lacked quality. It failed because it didn't fit the moment. Today, it stands as one of the most gripping films of its era, a reminder that timing can kill a film, even when everything else is perfect. New York, New York, 1977. This wasn't supposed to fail. Not with that director. Not with that cast. Expectations weren't just high, they were overwhelming. A grand musical set against the backdrop of post-war America, blending classic Hollywood style with modern storytelling. But when audiences finally saw it, something felt off. The tone shifted unpredictably. The characters weren't easy to love. The emotional core felt distant. Critics noticed, audiences followed. And just like that, it slipped into disappointment. But failure, in this case, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of re-evaluation. Because buried inside the film was something bold, something experimental. It wasn't trying to recreate the past, it was trying to challenge it. And over time, that ambition started to resonate. The performances gained new appreciation. The music lingered. The imperfections? They became part of its identity. Today, it's not remembered as a clean success, but as a fascinating and daring work from a filmmaker willing to take risks, and sometimes that matters more than immediate applause. 1941, 1979. Chaos. That's what audiences saw. Loud, exaggerated, almost uncontrollable chaos. A war comedy that pushed everything to the extreme. Bigger explosions, louder performances, faster pacing. It was meant to be entertaining. Instead, it overwhelmed people. Critics were harsh. Audiences were divided. And the box office reflected that confusion. It became known as a rare misstep from a rising filmmaker. Too much, too fast, too unfocused. But here's what changed over time. Distance. When viewed years later, without the weight of expectation, the film reveals something different. Not a failure, but an experiment. A filmmaker testing limits, playing with scale, and learning how far spectacle could go. And suddenly, those same qualities that once felt excessive began to feel intentional. Controlled chaos, bold choices, a stepping stone toward something bigger. It didn't become a classic in the traditional sense, but it earned something else. Respect. Because sometimes even a failure can be a crucial part of greatness in the making. Phantom of the Paradise, 1974. It arrived loud, chaotic, and completely out of step with what audiences thought they wanted. A rock opera, a horror satire, a twisted reimagining of Phantom of the Opera wrapped in glitter, distortion, and pure theatrical madness. And when it first hit theaters, people didn't embrace it. They rejected it. The tone was too strange, the style too aggressive, the satire too sharp to land comfortably. And it didn't fit into any single category, and that confusion became its downfall. Critics were divided, audiences stayed away, and the film quickly faded from the mainstream conversation. But something unusual happened in the years that followed. Instead of disappearing, it found pockets of obsession. Specific cities, specific audiences. People who didn't just like the film, they connected with it. Deeply. The music lingered. The visuals stayed burned into memory. And slowly, quietly, it transformed into a cult phenomenon. Today, it's not seen as a failure at all, but as a bold, visionary piece of filmmaking that was simply too ahead of its time. What once felt chaotic now feels intentional. What once felt excessive now feels iconic. It didn't change. The audience finally caught up. The Wiz, 1978. On paper, it looked unstoppable. A reimagining of a beloved classic. A major production. A cast filled with star power. But when it was released, the response was immediate and brutal. Critics questioned its length, its tone, its choices. Audiences felt disconnected. The box office numbers didn't just disappoint, they confirmed the narrative. This was a miscalculation. A film that aimed big and missed. But time has a way of reshaping perception. Because beneath the criticism was something undeniable, a distinct identity, a bold reinterpretation that refused to play it safe. As years passed, new audiences discovered it without the weight of expectation. And suddenly, the elements that once felt excessive began to feel expressive. The music resonated. The performances stood out. The visual ambition became part of its charm. But it didn't try to replicate the original. It tried to redefine it. And that risk, once punished, is now respected. Today, The Wiz holds a place not as a failure, but as a cultural statement. A film that dared to be different, and eventually earned the appreciation it didn't receive the first time around. The Warriors, 1979. It wasn't just rejected, it was feared. When it hit theaters, the reaction wasn't about storytelling or performances. It was about panic, reports of violence, concerns about influence. A film that audiences weren't just watching, they were reacting to. The studio pulled back, screenings were limited, and just like that, its theatrical run was cut short. What could have been a success turned into controversy. But controversy doesn't kill a film. It transforms it. Because once the noise faded, what remained was the film itself. And what people discovered later was something far more controlled than its reputation suggested. A stylized, almost mythic journey through a city that felt larger than life. a story built on movement, tension, and identity. It wasn't chaos, it was design, and over time, that design became appreciated. The dialogue, once mocked, became iconic. The imagery, once criticized, became unforgettable. Today, it stands as one of the most influential urban films of its era, not because it avoided controversy, but because it survived it, and in doing so, became something far greater than its original reception ever allowed. The Black Hole, 1979. It was supposed to be a response, a competitor, a way for a major studio to step into the world of serious science fiction. But audiences had already seen the future, and it didn't look like this. Compared to the optimism and adventure dominating the genre at the time, this film felt darker, colder, more philosophical, and that difference cost it. Viewers didn't fully connect. Critics were uncertain. The film didn't fail completely, but it didn't succeed the way it needed to. It lingered in an uncomfortable middle ground, but that's exactly where its legacy began to grow, because over time, that darkness became its strength. The tone, once criticized, began to feel unique. The themes, existence, isolation, obsession, started to resonate more deeply, and the visual ambition, especially for its time, became impossible to ignore. It wasn't trying to copy what was popular, it was trying to go somewhere else entirely. And years later, when that decision feels far more interesting than safe success ever could have been. It didn't win immediately, but it endured. The Long Goodbye, 1973. It took something familiar and quietly dismantled it. A detective story, a classic character, a genre audiences thought they understood. But instead of delivering what was expected, it subverted everything. The tone was relaxed, almost drifting. The lead character didn't feel heroic. He felt out of place. And that disconnect confused audiences. This wasn't the sharp, structured mystery they were used to. It was slower, stranger, more reflective. And at the time, that felt like a flaw. The film didn't perform well. It was seen as a misinterpretation, a missed opportunity. But years later, that exact same approach became its greatest strength. But because what once felt off now feels intentional, a deliberate shift away from tradition, a reimagining of a genre that had grown predictable. The character, once criticized, now feels deeply human. The pacing, once questioned, now feels immersive. It didn't fail because it misunderstood the genre. It failed because it understood it too well and chose to break it. Today, it's recognized not as a misstep, but as a turning point. A film that quietly changed the rules, long before audiences were ready for it. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. It didn't just fail, it repelled people. When it was released, audiences weren't prepared for what they were seeing. This wasn't a clean revenge story. It was dirty, violent, unpredictable, and emotionally unstable. The lead character wasn't heroic. He was desperate, obsessive, and slowly unraveling. Critics didn't hold back. They called it excessive, self-indulgent, even disturbing. And the box office reflected that rejection. It quickly gained a reputation as a misfire from a director who had gone too far. But that reaction missed something deeper, because beneath the chaos was a film that refused to compromise. Every decision felt personal. Every moment carried weight. It wasn't trying to entertain. It was trying to confront. And that confrontation made people uncomfortable. Over time, that discomfort turned into fascination. Viewers began to see the raw honesty in its storytelling. The brutality wasn't random. It was intentional, a reflection of a world without control or redemption. The performance at its center, once criticized, is now seen as fearless, completely committed. And that commitment is what gives the film its lasting power. Today, it's no longer dismissed as a failure. It's recognized as one of the boldest films of its decade, a work that didn't just challenge audiences, it forced them to look at something they didn't want to see. And sometimes, that's exactly what real cinema is supposed to do. Harold and Maude, 1971. It's almost impossible to imagine now, but when this film first released, people didn't embrace it. They rejected it. Completely. The premise alone felt too strange, too uncomfortable. A young man obsessed with death, forming a relationship with an older woman who celebrated life in the most unconventional ways. It didn't fit into any category audiences recognized. Was it a comedy A romance? Something darker? That uncertainty became its biggest obstacle. But critics were harsh. Some even called it inappropriate. And the box office followed their lead. It quietly disappeared, labeled as a failure. But then something unexpected happened. It found its audience, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, through word of mouth and late-night screenings. People began to see what others had missed. Beneath the unusual premise was something deeply human, a story about loneliness, connection, and the fragile balance between despair and hope. The tone, once criticized, became its greatest strength. It didn't treat heavy themes with distance. It embraced them with honesty and warmth. And that honesty resonated, especially with younger audiences searching for something real. Today, it's considered one of the most beloved cult classics of all time. Not because it changed, but because audiences finally understood it. It didn't fail. It simply arrived before people were ready to accept it. Days of Heaven, 1978. At first glance, it seemed like it should have worked. A visually stunning film, set against vast landscapes, crafted with precision and care. But when it was released, audiences didn't connect the way the studio expected. The pacing felt slow. The storytelling felt distant. It wasn't driven by action or clear structure. It unfolded quietly, almost like a memory. And that subtlety confused people. Critics were divided. Some praised its beauty, others questioned its purpose. The box office reflected that uncertainty. It didn't collapse completely, but it didn't succeed either. It existed in a strange space, admired but not embraced. And for years, well, that's how it was remembered. Until something shifted. Because over time, the very qualities that once felt like weaknesses began to feel intentional. The quiet pacing became immersive. The lack of traditional structure became poetic. And the visuals, those endless fields, that natural light, became iconic. This wasn't just a film. It was an experience, one that demanded patience. And when audiences finally gave it that patience, they saw what had always been there. A deeply emotional story told without excess, without noise. Today, it's considered one of the most beautiful films ever made, not because it changed, but because the way people watched it did. The Last Wave, 1977. It didn't fail loudly. It disappeared quietly. When it was released, audiences didn't know what to do with it. It blended mystery, spirituality, and cultural tension in a way that felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. There were no clear answers, no simple explanations. The narrative moved in layers, hinting at something deeper without ever fully revealing it. And for mainstream audiences, that ambiguity became a barrier. They wanted clarity, resolution. Instead, they were left with questions. Critics were intrigued but divided, and the box office response was minimal. It slipped away, unnoticed by most. But films like this don't disappear completely. They wait. Over time, viewers began to revisit it with a different perspective. Without the expectation of easy answers, the film opened up. Its atmosphere became its strength. The sense of unease, once confusing, became powerful. It wasn't about solving a mystery. It was about experiencing it. And that experience lingered, long after the film ended. Today, it's regarded as a haunting, thought-provoking work that explores themes far beyond its surface. Not a failure, but a film that required a different kind of attention, the kind audiences weren't ready to give at the time. The Hired Hand, 1971. It arrived with familiar expectations and quietly broke every one of them. On the surface, it looked like a traditional Western, a man returning home, a story of redemption. But what audiences got instead was something slower, more reflective, almost meditative. The pacing wasn't driven by action. It was driven by silence, by atmosphere, by moments that lingered longer than expected. And for audiences used to clear, structured storytelling, that felt like a mistake. The film didn't perform well. It was seen as too quiet, too unconventional, or too distant from what the genre was supposed to be. But that distance is exactly what gives it power today, because it wasn't trying to repeat the past. It was trying to rethink it. The characters feel real, flawed, uncertain. The world feels lived in, not dramatized, and the emotional weight builds slowly, almost invisibly. Over time, critics and audiences began to reassess it, not as a failed Western, but as a deeply personal one. a film more interested in feeling than spectacle. Today, it stands as one of the most quietly influential westerns of its era, not because it followed the rules, but because it had the courage to ignore them completely. They were dismissed, buried, and written off as failures. But time doesn't forget what truly matters. These films didn't just survive, they proved Hollywood wrong. So which one shocked you the most? And how many more failures are still waiting to be rediscovered? Because the next forgotten masterpiece might already be hiding in plain sight.